in my lab over winter term. He's really awesome, really smart, so I hope you guys enjoy it. Without further ado.
What's up, guys? Okay, so my name's Matt. I'm going to be talking today briefly about music in the brain as part of the Neuroscience lecture series. So let's get started. So, couple things in the big picture. I want you, the music and the brain are two very big, vague, and like intimidating concepts, and it's really hard sort of to think about them working together, but the most important thing here in the big picture is that it's a very dynamic relationship between music and the brain. So you have the brain enabling us to practice, perform, and appreciate different kinds of music, but then at the same time, you have the music feeding back on the brain and influencing it physiologically and emotionally. The second major big picture here is music in the brain in the context of neuroscience is a very young and emerging field, and there's a lot of current knowledge out there that's sort of exploding in the last 5 years, but there's also a lot of future directions. And the last thing is I just want to plug that there's this neuroscience course, 106, in the fall, Music in the Brain, which I helped compile a lot of the materials for, and I'm going to go a little bit into that today. Over winter term is when I compiled those materials. So it's going to be taught by a visiting professor, Scott Swartzwelder, and he taught Alcohol in the Brain last year for one module, but he's going to come back and teach this class. And I also will probably be a TA for it, unofficially. So you can talk to me all the time. All right. So this is just a rough outline of some of the topics that I was researching over winter term. And I'm not going to cover all of them today because it's obviously just like a ton. And like even one of those bullet points, I think Arnie Cox is going to teach a course on a higher level music theory course next fall too. So obviously you could spend a whole course on any one of these subjects, but it's really just to give you like a brief overview of all of these in the fall. And the topics that I'm going to cover today more specifically are these four. We're going to go over the anatomical regions involved in music, cognition, and perception. We're going to do a brief overview, and then we're also going to talk more specifically about the brainstem in musicians. We're going to look at similarities and differences between music and language. And we're going to talk about syntax versus semantics. Don't worry, I'll get to those confusing S words in a second. And then we're going to go into live performance and improvisation. We're going to talk about some of the brain regions behind creative thought processes. And then finally, we're going to look at music and clinical neurology in the context of neurological music therapy and neurological diseases. Okay, so first category is major anatomical regions involved. So the major takeaway here is that music is so great at having simultaneous and widespread activation in the brain. This is a quote that I found. There are very few human activities as pervasive as musicianship that recruit so many areas of the brain. So you have motor regions, you have sensory regions, you have high-order thinking regions, you have regions involved in emotion and memory, all being activated simultaneously. And music is one of the best stimuli in order to achieve this in the brain. So that's why it's so effective. Okay, so the brainstem. I actually didn't know this until I was looking at it over the summer and more into winter term, but I thought that when you process music, all of it goes on in your cortex up here, and the signal just comes in from your ears, and this is where you really do all the processing. But what I learned is there's a lot of early processing and dissociation between different musical components that takes place in your brainstem before it even gets to your brain, or your cortex. So you have this phenomenon known as phase locking in the brainstem. And phase locking is when you play a musical tone or musical rhythm, and from the onset of that stimulus, a neuron will fire in time with the frequency or regularity of that musical component. And so you see this on the right. They did a study, and they looked at timing, pitch, and timbre. You guys are probably familiar with timing and pitch, but timbre is basically just, if you have a frequency spectrum, the different combinations and strengths of specific frequencies in an instrument is what forms that specific sound of the instrument. So a piano versus a clarinet is different combinations of these spectral frequencies. And so this is just a little fun fact, along with the brainstem response, is that musicians' brains show greater sensitivity to their own instrument than other instruments, which is really, really cool in the brainstem. All right, second topic, language and music. Some of the major similarities. We have concrete ones like rhythm. Both language and music involve this aspect of regular rhythm and time. And then they also have different pitch relationships. You have tonal languages, or when I'm telling you a question, I normally go up at the end of it, or if I'm saying something definitive, I resolve downwards. So they both have that component of melody. You also have syntax, which I'm going to define now, basically as the order of constituents. So the order of words you have in a sentence, or the order of notes that you play to form a melody. Both language and music have that. And then they also can convey some sort of emotion, or they have some sort of affect. As for conceptual similarities, both language and music involve rapid real-time processing. So it's a very complicated thing to be processing these in real time, but both music and language, it's happening simultaneously, which is really, really cool with all these regions of the brain. And then you can also convey meaning in the order of the constituents. So if I flip-flop some words in a sentence between two people, it's going to mean totally different things. Same thing with a melody or a chord progression, you know? You have like dominant tension and resolution in music. So major differences between language and music. In language, you have less of a stable rhythm. Like, I don't talk like this when I'm talking to, like, you know, you don't really have that in language as much. You don't really have set pitches. So if you're speaking a tonal language, it's more about the contour of a phrase. Like Mandarin, you don't have to start on a G sharp in order to have the right meaning. And then in language, the grammar can really induce semantic meaning, which is basically like if I'm telling you to go to the store to get me a carton of milk, I can't like say that with a musical phrase. So language sort of has an advantage there. So let's go into some of the cooler hidden connections that I found between language and music. And these studies were done by this really cool researcher named Anirudh Patel at Tufts University. I don't know if you've checked these out yet. I got a nod in the back. That's cool. So one of the really cool correlations between language and music is Ani took a huge assay where he looked at the level of contrast between different vowel stresses in both the English language and the French language. And you notice that the English language, in general, has a higher level of contrast between neighboring vowel sounds. So you have this short, long, as you can see in the diagram below, in the English language. So that's a higher level of contrast with vowel stresses. Whereas in the French language, you tend to have a lower level of contrast with the longer vowel stresses being grouped together and the shorter vowel stresses being grouped together. So they took this big assay of the two different languages, and then they compared that to note length choices between a huge list of English composers and French composers, and they noticed a correlation between the different stresses and lengths of the notes, which is really, really cool. The second major study that I found was Ani looked at the effect of music on its interference with syntactic processing of language versus semantic processing of language. So music is way more effective at disrupting your ability to process the order of things in a sentence, but it doesn't really interfere with the meaning of the sentence itself. And so from these two studies, he sort of proposed this shared syntactic integration hypothesis, which basically states that linguistic and musical syntactic representations in the brain are very distinct, and they have noticed that, but there also has to be some overlap with this. So yeah, that was the shared syntactic integration hypothesis. As for some applications of all this music and language talk, there's this one study done by Hassan Martina in 2011 that looked at dyslexia, and they noticed that metrical sensitivity can predict the reading ability of a young individual, which is really, really cool. And dyslexics perform pretty poorly on a lot of melodic and rhythmic tasks. So basically, they inferred from this in the study, they proposed that musical training should be implemented into a lot of early programs in young development to improve reading ability, which is pretty cool. Okay, next major topic is live performance and improvisation. This is my personal favorite. But yeah, so this is probably my favorite study of the talk done by Charles Lim in 2008, who's a researcher at Johns Hopkins University. And he basically took a bunch of professional jazz musicians, keyboard players in particular, and freestyle rappers, and put them into MRI machines. So MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and fMRI is functional magnetic resonance imaging, which basically monitors the blood flow to different regions of your brain to get a quantitative, to quantify how much activity is going on in those portions. So he put them into this machine and had them improvise versus play something that they knew like a melody, and then he had rappers freestyle versus recite a verse that they already knew. And he noticed, surprisingly, when you think about improvisation, you think about how it's very complex. The frontal lobe in your brain is really responsible for this high order processing and like consciousness. And you would think that that would be very active during this process. But what he actually discovered was that it's actually suppressed during improvisation and freestyle rap, which was so the way he explained these results was that in order to get into this creative mode during your performance, you really have to shut down this like monitoring and consciousness you have in the front of your brain. And just going off that, there's another psychologist, I forget the name of the psychologist who discovered this. Someone can yell it out if they know it. But it's this concept of flow, which basically maximizes your skill level on your instrument or whatever art you're performing with the challenge of that task. And when you maximize those together, you enter this sort of state in the top right, as you can see on the graph, of flow, where it's like the maximization of your creative abilities. Just one more thing. This is Pressing in 1998. He sort of gave us his own definition of improvisation, which was balancing rehearsed retrieval cues. So jazz majors like to call these licks, or just like phrases that you have in sort of your like bag of tricks that you can bring out and put together with idea generation. So it's sort of a balance between retrieving and generating. And it's interesting because I was watching an improv lecture by Gary Burton, who's a very famous jazz vibraphonist, and he talked about improvisation being a dynamic between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. So it's very, very similar, and you have subjective reports from musicians that match this scientific description, which is pretty cool. One final thing is improvisation controlled or uncontrolled. You know, we saw like this suppression of these higher order processes, which implies that it's really uncontrolled. But then at the same time, you have recalling of these licks, and also you have feedback from your instrument. You know, if you play something that you weren't expecting, you sort of have to correct that error in the moment, and it's very conscious in that sense and controlled. So I think it's a balance of both, basically, is the answer there. But that's definitely a debate in the current scientific field. So divergent and creative thinking, like improvisation, it taps broader neurological networks, and it's this very high order processes. But how do we measure that? You know, it's a very difficult thing to try and measure scientifically. And one of the things that they proposed was this task called the alternate use task. And I was going to have you guys do it, but I don't think we have time. Basically, what you do is you get a grid of circles that are totally blank, and I give you like 30 seconds or a minute, and you just have to create as many things as you can using the circles. So like a planet, a basketball, a smiley face. You just have to like draw them out as fast as you can. And so what they did with jazz majors is at a university, they gave them this task, and then they had professional jazz musicians sort of rate their fluency with improvisation and their ability. And they found that the performance on the alternate use task correlated positively with their ability to generate and have improvisational fluidity, which is really, really cool. That was a study done by Beatty in 2013, so pretty recent. All right, last topic, music as medicine. We're going to talk a little bit about neurological music therapy and then get into its implications with neurological disorders. So this is what I did the winter term before this winter term. As you can see, I look a little bit younger and baby-faced. But yeah, so this is my friend Brian, who's a neurological music therapist at Spalding Rehab Center for stroke and traumatic injury patients. And yeah, I visited him and shadowed him for a couple days at the rehab center, which was really, really cool. And yeah, the other picture is just someone receiving music therapy in a hospital. But okay, so neurological music therapy. So a lot of people think music therapy is this very like, you know, wishy-washy, and it like taps into your spirituality and like really, really like, not to say that that's not great, but neurological music therapy is it's a much more systematic and scientific approach that narrows down and addresses a lot of the research and targets these specific deficits that people have with traumatic injuries in order to improve them. And it's got three major targets. The first being memory. Music, I don't know if you've heard of this psychological concept called chunking, but basically if I give you like a phone number, there's a number, there's the magic number, 7 plus or minus 2, of how many items that you can remember before you really start to struggle and forget. And so chunking is this phenomena. You see it in musical form or like groupings of notes that pretty much enables you to remember things better by grouping them into larger chunks. So if I gave you this like lyric, fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars, let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars, you'd be like, that's 39 words. I have no idea. Like, I totally forget all of those. But if I give you the musical phrase with Frank Sinatra singing it, you know, you'll have a much easier time of remembering it next time. So it facilitates chunking in that sense. And it's also really powerful with associative memory. I'm going to get more into that with the next slide with Alzheimer's. But the second target is attention and neglect. So they've found that music, so people who have this deficit called visuospatial neglect, they have a traumatic injury on one side of their brain, and on the contralateral side in their vision, they just totally ignore what's going on. So they have no awareness of it at all. So if I had visuospatial neglect and I had a traumatic injury in my right half, if people put like the entire floor, or if they had a spot on the floor and they just put it coated in $1 bills, and they would say, "This is your money, go ahead, pick it up," I would only pick up the ones on the left side and totally ignore the ones. Sorry, if I had the injury on the right, I would totally ignore the ones on the contralateral side on the left side. So it's this really crazy deficit that happens. But they found that music and cues using music are way better at sort of resolving this visuospatial neglect than speech or visual cues, which is very interesting. And then Brian, who the guy I shadowed, one task he uses for attention is he gives all these different patients bells with different musical tones. And then he plays a melody, and they have to recreate the melody as a team. So they each have their own bell, and that involves a lot of attention. And it's really interesting just to see how like everyone is totally spacing out and like just looking out the windows, and then he starts the task and gives them the melody, and everyone's like looking around, waiting their turn. So it's like very effective in getting people's attention. And then the final target is emotional adjustment and motivation. And what they've noticed with a lot of these injuries is, you know, they're very traumatic, and people go through these like they're very just. It's really tough to see. I've had a couple families come in and visit while we were doing some therapy, and it's just like really tough to see them like talking about what they used to be like, and you know, it's just really hard. So it's very great for the patients to cope and also just gain a little bit more spirituality from the treatment. And then we've also noticed with a lot of gathering of data from patients is that they have higher self-efficacy ratings and self-confidence after they go through music therapy in comparison to other therapies, which is really, really cool. Not just science, you know, it's a little bit personal. Last thing is NMT, Neurological Music Therapy's relation to neurological disorders. So with Alzheimer's, like I was talking about before, it's really great at triggering autobiographical memory. I was going to show you guys a video, but it's called, if you go to YouTube and you type in the power of music, there's this Alzheimer's victim who is just like totally down in his chair, does not talk to anyone, and then they put some headphones on him, and he like never really talks to anyone, just mumbles, but they put some headphones on him with his favorite music, and he just like he lights up, his eyes go big, and he's just like singing and making all this noise, and then people come over to talk to him, and he just starts responding to them, like having a conversation with yes or no answers. It's like the craziest thing. So it's great at triggering these autobiographical memories. I know, like for one thing, like the song you play at your wedding is like a huge trigger of brain activity in the brain, which is really cool. Second thing is Parkinson's, which is a deficit in your brain with initiating motor movements. So you have a tough time walking or like starting to grab something or something like that. And they've shown that music has been way more effective than a lot of other methods of gait training, so walking to musical meter. If you get a beat, it's way easier to walk to than if someone's trying to talk you through the walking. And then finally, we have aphasia, which is basically a difficulty in producing and processing speech. And the solution they have for that, I met with this guy named Gottfried Schlaug back in Boston, and he's a researcher at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, I think is the formal name. And he coined this thing with his research called melodic intonation therapy, which basically has two principles. You have contour and you have tapping. So you have the contour of your voice. They would link basic phrases. So these people can't even get out stuff like I'm hungry or I need to go to the bathroom. You know, it's just like a struggle. So what you do is you link like bathroom, you link these pitches to the phrase and the syllables, and then you also tap them out at the same time. So bathroom, the patients, and it really helps them get out the message and even just the word in general of what they're trying to say. So that's been something that's been implicated in a lot of therapies throughout the country right now. All right, so just a little summary. We talked about anatomical regions. The major takeaway there was we have simultaneous and widespread activation with music. We talked about early processing in the brainstem, which is also very specialized for musicians in comparison to non-musicians. We went through real-time processing of rhythm, melody, syntax, and affect in music and language. We talked about suppressed high-order neural networks in live performance and improvisation. And then finally, we just talked about neurological music therapy's effectiveness with memory, movement, speech, and emotion. So if you want more, come check out the class in the fall. We're going to cover all of those topics in more depth and more, plenty more, almost double that. And then, also check out this music and emotion class if you want to, which is being taught by Arnie Cox. Thanks to you guys for coming.
Yeah, baby.